August 16, 1715. The Sun King lies dying. His finance minister trembles before advisors with a confession that will shock Europe. There is no money left. The world's richest kingdom, builder of Versailles, is bankrupt, and the pattern that destroyed France is unfolding in America right now. Most think government debt is just numbers on a screen. This video reveals the brutal truth. Debt doesn't bankrupt nations slowly. It happens suddenly, catastrophically, after decades of warning signs ignored. In the next few minutes, you'll see the 3 debt patterns that toppled France, and why America is repeating every one of them. Let me take you back to a world that no longer exists. The year is 1661. Louis XIV, just 23 years old, stands before his council and declares something audacious. He will rule alone. No prime minister. No shared power. Just him. And for the next 54 years, he will transform France into something the world has never seen. A kingdom so magnificent, so dazzling, that every monarch in Europe will try desperately to copy it. France isn't just powerful. It's the center of gravity for an entire civilization. 20 million people call it home, more than any other European nation. Its armies are the largest on the continent. Its language becomes the tongue of diplomacy, philosophy, and elegance. When you want to impress someone in the 1600s, you speak French. When you want to show wealth, you buy French art, French fashion, French everything. And then, Louis builds Versailles. Not a palace, a statement. Fountains that seem to defy physics, gold leaf covering every surface, mirrors lining an entire hall, each one imported at staggering cost. Thousands of nobles live there, dressed in silk, dancing until dawn, playing games of power in rooms designed to overwhelm the senses. Versailles isn't architecture, it's theater. It's Louis telling the world, I am the Sun King, and you all revolve around me. And for a while, it works. France dominates global trade. Its merchants move goods across continents. Its culture shapes how people think, dress, dream. If you're not French, you wish you were. But here's what no one talks about while they're staring at the gold and the glory. Behind the magnificence, a system is breaking. France's tax structure is a disaster. The nobles, the people with the most wealth, pay almost nothing. The clergy, who own vast estates, are exempt. The burden falls entirely on peasants and merchants, the people least able to carry it. It's inefficient. It's unfair, and it's completely unsustainable. But no one dares reform it, because the people who would lose their privileges are the same people who hold the power. And then there are the wars. Louis is obsessed with expanding France's glory, and glory requires conquest. War of Devolution, Dutch War, War of the Spanish Succession. One conflict after another, each one more expensive than the last. France fields the largest standing army in Europe, 400,000 men at its peak. Feeding them, paying them, equipping them drains the treasury at a terrifying rate. Early on, the debt grows slowly, almost invisibly. A loan here, a bond issue there. But then it accelerates. Borrowing becomes the only way to keep the machine running. And here's the trap. Debt doesn't just sit there, it grows. Interest payments start consuming revenues. The treasury borrows more just to pay what it already owes. France becomes dependent on creditor bankers, many of them foreign, many of them whispering nervously about whether the kingdom can actually pay them back. On the surface, everything still sparkles. Versailles still dazzles. The army still marches. But beneath it all, the foundation is cracking. France financed its glory with tomorrow's money, and tomorrow is coming. The very systems that made it the envy of the world are now silently, steadily destroying it. Debt has become the silent killer. And no one, not Louis, not his ministers, not the nobles dancing in the Hall of Mirrors, sees it coming. Now watch what happens when a kingdom chooses glory over arithmetic. In 1688, France plunges into the 9 Years' War. Louis wants to secure his borders, expand his influence, assert dominance over Europe. It sounds reasonable. It sounds strategic. But wars don't care about your reasoning. They care about your treasury. And this one devours it. The costs explode beyond anything his ministers predicted. Suddenly, the debt isn't a small problem anymore. It's a growing monster, feeding on itself. But Louis doesn't pull back. He can't. Restraint would look like weakness, and weakness is unthinkable for the Sun King. So he borrows more. The pile swells, and everyone tells themselves it's manageable, it's temporary. Victory will pay for everything. Then comes 1701, the War of Spanish Succession. This is the war that breaks everything. It lasts 13 years. 13 years of relentless grinding expense. At its peak, war spending consumes 75% of the royal budget. 75%. Think about that. 3/4 of everything France collects goes to feeding, arming, and moving soldiers. And here's where it gets truly suffocating. Interest payments on the debt become larger than the military payroll itself. France is now spending more money servicing what it owes than on the very wars it's fighting. The kingdom is paying for past decisions while making new ones it can't afford. And then nature strikes. In 1709, the worst winter in a century freezes Europe. Crops fail. Famine spreads. People starve in the streets while Versailles still glitters. Tax revenues collapse because you can't squeeze money from people who have nothing left. But the debt doesn't care about famine. The creditors don't pause. The interest keeps compounding. So Louis does what desperate rulers always do. He forces loans from his own people. He debases the currency, melting coins and reminting them with less silver, hoping no one notices the inflation that follows. He's no longer governing. He's improvising, trying to buy one more month, one more year. Now let's talk about the tax system, because this is where the whole structure reveals itself as rotten. France has a simple problem. The people with money don't pay taxes, and the people without money can't. The nobles are almost entirely exempt. They claim ancient privileges, and no one dares challenge them. The clergy owns vast estates and pays nothing. The entire burden falls on peasants and merchants, the backbone of the economy, and they're being crushed. But here's the cruelest part. Even the taxes that should be collected aren't. France privatized tax collection, selling the right to collect to the highest bidder. These tax farmers pocket a huge percentage before it ever reaches the treasury. Corruption is built into the system. France collects less than half of what it theoretically should. The state is bleeding revenue, while the rich protect their wealth, and the poor have nothing left to give. And the creditors notice. Trust begins to crack. Slowly at first, then all at once. France has to borrow at higher and higher interest rates because lenders see the risk. Foreign banks start dictating terms. The finance houses in Paris, the ones that used to fund the monarchy's ambitions without question, begin to collapse under the pressure. The balance of power flips. The kingdom that once controlled everyone is now dependent on the people it borrowed from. Louis is no longer sovereign over his own finances. By 1715, something astonishing has happened. France still has the largest army. It still has Versailles. It still looks like a superpower. But it's bankrupt. Completely, undeniably bankrupt. The empire collapsed financially before it collapsed politically. That's the warning. That's the pattern. Nations don't fall. because they lose wars. They fall because they can't pay for them. France is now a kingdom, living on borrowed time, and everyone, except perhaps Louis himself, knows it. Louis XIV dies in 1715, but the debt doesn't die with him. It passes to his great-grandson, Louis XV, a child king who inherits a kingdom that looks magnificent, but is financially hollowed out. And here's the tragedy. Louis XIV understands the problem. He tries reforms. He brings in capable ministers who propose fixing the tax system, making the nobles pay their share, restructuring the debt. But every attempt crashes against the same wall: political resistance. The people who benefit from the broken system are the same people whose support the king needs to stay in power. So the reforms fail. And when reform fails, there's only one option left: borrow more. The cycle continues, deeper and faster than before. Then comes the 7 Years' War, and the costs explode into something exponential. France fights across multiple continents: Europe, North America, India. It's a global conflict, and global conflicts drain treasuries at speeds that make previous wars look quaint. France loses, badly. It loses territory, prestige, and an unimaginable amount of money. The debt, already massive, balloons into something almost incomprehensible. But the kingdom keeps spending, keeps borrowing, keeps pretending the bill will never come due. Now we arrive at the 1770s and 1780s, and this is where the death spiral becomes undeniable. France decides to support the American Revolution. On the surface, it's strategic: weaken Britain, restore French prestige, reclaim some honor after the humiliation of the 7 Years' War. But the cost is staggering. That war alone adds 1.3 billion livres to the national debt. By 1788, half of France's entire budget goes to interest payments, not to soldiers, not to infrastructure, not to governance, just interest. Paying back what was borrowed yesterday, so the kingdom can borrow again tomorrow. France has become a machine that exists only to service its own debt. And here's the number that should make your spine tingle: 50%. That's the threshold. When half your budget goes to interest, you've crossed into terminal territory. The kingdom can no longer function. Every other priority gets starved: defense, administration, public welfare, everything. And in 2024, America just crossed that same threshold, the same percentage, the same warning sign. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes with terrifying precision. In France, the debt forces the monarchy's hand. Louis XVI has no choice. He calls the Estates General in 1789, a desperate attempt to find some way, any way, to fix the fiscal collapse. It's the first time the assembly has been called in over a century. But once you open that door, you can't control what walks through. The meeting spirals. Grievances pour out. The Third Estate declares itself the true representative of France. Within months, the revolution ignites. The Bastille falls. The old order crumbles. And here's what matters. The French Revolution didn't start because people were ideologically opposed to monarchy. It started because the monarchy could no longer pay its bills. The richest, oldest kingdom in Europe collapsed under the weight of its own debt. Not because of uprisings alone, not because of bad luck, because it spent decades financing glory with money it didn't have. And this is where America enters the story. Not in 1789, but today. So let's talk about America. $38 trillion in debt. That's not a headline. That's the current reality. As of late 2025, the U.S. national debt has crossed $38 trillion, climbing faster than at any point in modern history. And this isn't an abstraction. The debt now sits at well over 100% of GDP, barreling toward the levels France hit right before its collapse. Some projections place America's debt-to-GDP ratio pushing into the 120–130% range in the coming years, if nothing changes. But here's the number that should stop anyone cold. In 2025, the United States is spending more on interest payments than on national defense. Let that sink in. Net interest on the federal debt is approaching $970 billion, surpassing defense spending for the first time in U.S. history. Read that again. America now spends more servicing its debt than protecting itself. France hit that milestone right before everything collapsed. The parallel isn't subtle, it's glaring. And just like France became dependent on powerful foreign creditors, America is now exposed in the same way. Foreign governments and investors hold about $7.7 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities, with China, Japan, and global financial networks carrying enormous leverage over the U.S. economy. When you owe that much to others, your sovereignty doesn't disappear in a single moment. It erodes quietly, one bond issue at a time. Meanwhile, borrowing is getting more expensive. The average interest rate on U.S. debt has climbed to around 3.35%, meaning every new dollar of debt costs more than the last. The trap is tightening. Now think about military overstretch. France maintained the largest standing army in Europe, draining its treasury to project dominance. America maintains hundreds of overseas bases, a global military footprint unlike anything in history. The scale is different, but the logic is identical. Both empires burned mountains of money to maintain global supremacy, believing power justified any cost. But power is expensive, and when the bill comes due, it doesn't negotiate. France's currency and financial credibility collapsed before the kingdom did. And today, for the first time in generations, the dollar's dominance faces real challenges. BRICS nations are developing alternative payment systems. De-dollarization is no longer theoretical. It's policy. Sanctions, once a tool of American influence, now push countries to build ways around the dollar entirely. And here's the danger. When trust in your currency fades, you lose the ability to borrow cheaply. When borrowing becomes expensive, the debt spiral accelerates. And when interest outpaces revenue, collapse doesn't arrive slowly. It arrives all at once. Here's the moment that destroyed France. Not a lost battle, not a street revolt, but the moment when interest payments became so large that the kingdom had to borrow just to pay the interest on what it already owed. America is entering that phase right now. The question isn't whether this is sustainable. It's not. The real question is this: what happens when the world's largest economy can't pay interest without adding to the debt? What will be America's war of Spanish succession? The crisis that pushes the system past the breaking point? What will be America's version of funding the American Revolution, an expensive foreign commitment that accelerates collapse? And most of all, what will be America's 1789? The moment when a fiscal crisis forces a political reckoning no one can control. Now, America still has advantages France could never dream of. Technology, innovation, a diversified economy, and the deepest capital markets on earth. But none of that makes a nation immune to mathematics. Debt destroys even the strongest empires when leaders ignore it, delay the truth, and choose short-term comfort over long-term survival. This isn't about pessimism. It's about awareness. It's about recognizing the pattern before it becomes irreversible. Superpowers don't fall because they're weak. They fall because they refuse to believe they can. If this brought you insight, like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes empires never fall. Because they do. And the signs are already here.